All right, so today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the life and crimes of Cecil Henry Floyd, a serial killer who was active in the 1970s in America. And we have some excerpts from his Wikipedia article, as well as a couple other sources that we're going to be pulling from.
Oh, interesting.
And yeah, we're going to be uncovering not just what he did, but also try to understand the how and why behind his crimes and kind of get a sense of, what makes this case so interesting.
Yeah, and you know what's really interesting about this is even though we have a confession, Floyd's story have a lot of unanswered questions,
Yeah.
right? There's some victims that remain unidentified and like hints of more crimes than the ones he was actually convicted for. So it's kind of like this puzzle with some pieces missing.
Yeah, for sure. So Cecil Henry Floyd was born in 1945, but his story really takes a turn in 1971 when he marries Lorna Dean Kern. And Lorna later claimed that she was forced into this marriage and that Floyd threatened her children to get her to comply. She also described him as paranoid and abusive.
If we connect this back to the bigger picture, Lorna's claims raise some really serious questions. Like, was she a victim herself, or was there some complicity in Floyd's crimes? Her story really adds like another layer of complexity to the whole case.
Right, it really makes you wonder about her role in everything that happened. But fast forward to 1973, and we have the first confirmed murder. 15-year-old Henry Michael Mazer disappeared near a fair in Indiana.
And this is where the case takes this first unexpected turn. Police actually arrested a carnival worker, Robert Stewart, for the murder. They had evidence that linked him to a stolen car, and the carnival setting made him an easy target.
It seems like kind of a flimsy connection, so how did they rule him out as a suspect?
Well, Stewart insisted that he was innocent,
Yeah.
right? And even claimed that a blonde young man was with him during the car theft. And what's important is that he passed a polygraph test, which led to the charges being completely dropped. It's like a textbook example of how those initial assumptions can really derail an investigation.
Yeah, totally. And unfortunately, while they were focused on the wrong man, young Mazer's body was found. He'd been shot to death. This wasn't just a disappearance, it was murder. And it marked the beginning of Floyd's spree.
Right, and the crimes just become more brazen, they get more violent. Later that same year, Floyd, with an accomplice named Thomas Mattingly, robbed a motel in Florida.
Hmm.
But it wasn't just a robbery. Floyd brutally beat one of the owners, Barney Rysick, with a claw hammer. He struck him 66 times.
Wow. This detail about the 66 blows is really crazy to me. It's not just violence, it's like rage. Is that a pattern you see in other serial killers? This escalation from guns to more personal and brutal methods?
What's interesting here is that while some serial killers do show a progression in their methods, it's not always towards more brutality. It can be about control, experimentation, or even a weird sense of efficiency. In Floyd's case, though, the sheer number of blows in the Rice Lake murder definitely suggests something beyond just the need to subdue the victim. It points to this deeper psychological element that I think is really worth exploring.
Okay, so Floyd's crimes weren't just confined to one state, though, were they?
No, not at all. His activities span all the way from Indiana to Florida, even reaching Nebraska and Kansas. And his victims were just as diverse as the locations. Men, women, different ages, different walks of life, some seemingly random, others maybe more targeted. It was all over the place, both literally and figuratively.
So we have this puzzle forming, right? We have this possibly escalating violence, this wide geographical range, and this mix of seemingly random and maybe targeted victims. Did investigators ever find a pattern, something that connected these crimes beyond just Floyd himself?
That's one of the big questions with Floyd. There are these threads that could suggest patterns, but they're not definitive. For example, there's the murder of 17-year-old Karen Chitwood in her Orlando apartment. She was bound, gagged, her skull was crushed, and she was stabbed multiple times.
Oh, that's awful. Was there any sign of robbery or a motive?
Police suspected robbery because a TV and clock radio were missing, but there was no evidence of sexual assault, which makes it even more confusing. Did he target her specifically, or is it a crime of opportunity? These are the kinds of questions that we're still kind of dealing with in the Floyd case.
And then there's the Dickinson County John Doe, a hitchhiker found shot to death in Kansas. It's like a ghost story in the middle of this already dark narrative. What can you tell us about this victim?
Well, unfortunately, very little. He's still unidentified today. A stark reminder of how some victims can really get lost in the larger narrative of a serial killer's crimes.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking to think that even decades later, he's still nameless. Did investigators ever find any clues to his identity or connect him to Floyd definitively?
That's a story for later in our deep dive. But what's really crucial to understand now is that even with Floyd's eventual capture, the Dickinson County John Doe's case and all those unanswered questions remained a big part of this larger unsettling story.
Wow.
Yeah. All right. So we left off with Cecil Henry Floyd's crimes, spanning multiple states, leaving investigators to piece together this complex puzzle of violence and unanswered questions. But eventually, his reign of terror came to an end.
You mentioned his capture earlier. What were the circumstances that finally led to his arrest?
It wasn't a dramatic shootout or a chase through the streets. In 1974, Floyd was arrested in Arkansas, but not for murder. He was caught for armed robbery.
Oh, wow. So it was a chance encounter that brought him down.
In a way, yes. While in custody for the robbery, he was linked to the murder of Lester Schmidt, a gas station attendant in Nebraska. And that connection opened the floodgates.
Because once they had him for one murder, they could start looking at him for others.
Exactly. And Floyd didn't exactly make things difficult for them. While he was awaiting trial, he confessed to 6 murders across multiple states. But what's even more chilling is that he claimed responsibility for 5 more, bringing the potential victim count to 11.
Wow, that's a staggering number. Did investigators ever confirm those additional 5 murders? Did they find any evidence to support his claims?
That's one of the lingering mysteries in this case. The sources that we have don't provide a definitive answer. It's possible that law enforcement investigated his claims, but just couldn't find enough concrete evidence to link him to any other unsolved cases. Or maybe those details are hidden away in case files somewhere, just waiting to be rediscovered.
Right. So we have these potential victims out there, maybe connected to Floyd, maybe not. It's a chilling thought.
It is. And it really speaks to, the ripple effect of a serial killer's actions. Even decades later, there are families who may not have closure. They may still be wondering if their loved one was a victim of Cecil Henry Floyd.
Absolutely. So what about the confirmed murders? What happened with the trials and the convictions?
Well, the legal proceedings were just as complex as the crimes themselves. Floyd faced charges in multiple states, and each case had its own unique twists and turns.
Let's start with Florida then, since that's where his spree turned so violent.
Okay, yeah. In August of 1974, just a few months after his arrest, Floyd was arraigned in Orlando on charges of murder and false imprisonment. Then in January of 1975, he pleaded guilty to all counts.
So a full confession, you'd think that would be a pretty quick sentencing.
You would think so, right? But it was that straightforward. Sentencing in Florida was delayed because Floyd was also facing charges in Indiana for the murder of Henry Michael Mazer, the young man killed near the fair.
So it became a jurisdictional battle, with each state wanting to prosecute him first. What happened with Floyd's accomplice in Florida, Thomas Mattingly? Was he tried alongside Floyd?
No, Mattingly was extradited back to Florida and faced his own trial for first-degree murder in the death of Barney Rysick, the motel owner.
Okay, and how did that trial play out? Did Mattingly's association with Floyd, seal his fate?
It's actually one of the most surprising twists in this whole story. Despite Floyd's confession and implication of Mattingly, the jury acquitted Mattingly in March of 1975. He walked free.
He was acquitted, but Floyd had already confessed. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, here's where it gets even stranger. During Mattingly's trial, both Floyd and his attorney argued that Mattingly was innocent and that Floyd alone had committed the murder. And for whatever reason, the jury believed them.
So Floyd, a confessed serial killer, helped his accomplice get acquitted of murder. That's unbelievable. What about the other trials? What happened in Indiana and Nebraska?
So Floyd was finally convicted in Nebraska for the murder of Lester Schmidt, the gas station attendant, in May of 1975. He received a life sentence and was sent to the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City.
Okay, so one life sentence down. How about Indiana? Did he face a similar outcome there?
Yeah, he was also convicted in Indiana for the murder of Henry Michael Mazer and received a second life sentence. It's not totally clear when that trial took place, but he was already serving time in Indiana for the Nebraska conviction.
Okay, so 2 life sentences running concurrently. And what about the Kansas case, the unidentified hitchhiker? Did Floyd ever face justice for that crime?
That's where things get a little complicated. Dickinson County Attorney Steve Opet did file murder charges against Floyd for that case in February of 1975. But with Floyd already serving 2 life sentences, the decision was made to not pursue an additional sentence for the Kansas murder.
So the case was essentially closed, without a trial, without a definitive conviction for that specific murder.
Exactly. It was left in this kind of legal limbo. The charges were filed, but never formally pursued because of the existing life sentences. This left a sense of unresolved justice for the victim and any potential family he may have had.
It seems like there was a real push to ensure Floyd would never see the outside of a prison cell again.
That's certainly the impression you get from how the various cases were handled. But there's another incredible wrinkle in this story. Remember how I mentioned that the sentencing in Florida was delayed?
Yes.
Well, it turns out that Floyd was never formally sentenced for his crimes in that state, even though he had pleaded guilty back in 1975.
He was never sentenced. How is that even possible?
It boils down to a legal quirk in Florida law at the time.
Hmm.
Even if a defendant pleaded guilty, they were still eligible for the death penalty and had to go through a formal sentencing process. Since Floyd was already serving multiple life terms in another state, Florida just never got around to formally sentencing him.
So for over 2 decades, there was this open case in Florida, this possibility that he could be extradited back and potentially face the death penalty.
Yes, and that's exactly what happened in 1998. More than 20 years after his initial conviction, Florida officials sought to bring him back to their state to pursue the death penalty.
Wow. So what happened next? Did they extradite him? Was he put on death row?
That's where the trail gets a little murky. The records aren't really clear on whether he was actually brought back to Florida or if the death penalty proceedings ever formally began.
Yeah.
However, we do know that Floyd died in prison in Indiana in 2011.
So in a bizarre twist, this serial killer who confessed to 6 murders and claimed responsibility for 5 more potentially escaped the death penalty because of a bureaucratic oversight.
Yeah, it's a strange and somewhat unsettling end to this chapter of the story. But even with Floyd's death, the case remained active in other ways. Remember the Dickinson County John Doe, the unidentified hitchhiker in Kansas.
Yes, his case was never truly closed, was it? What happened there?
In 2016, the Dickinson County Sheriff's Office, along with the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, they exhumed the John Doe's body. They were hoping to use modern DNA technology, which wasn't available in the 1970s, to finally identify him.
That's an incredible effort. Decades after the crime, were they successful?
Sadly, no. As of 2024, the man remains unidentified. But even though the exhumation didn't lead to a definitive identification, it did spark this renewed interest in the case.
It shows their dedication to finding answers, even after all these years. What about the John Doe's final resting place?
He was buried in the Abilene Cemetery in Kansas, but without a headstone, without a name. He and a Jane Doe were the only 2 murder victims in the entire cemetery without proper markers.
Oh, that's heartbreaking. To be a victim of such a horrific crime and then to be forgotten, buried in an unmarked grave, did anything change?
Yeah, in 2019, a local fundraiser was launched to erect headstones for both the John Doe and the Jane Doe. It was a really beautiful act of compassion, a recognition that every victim deserves to be remembered, even if their identity remains unknown.
I agree. We've covered so much ground, from the brutal murders to the complex legal battles and even the strange circumstances surrounding Floyd's sentencing in Florida. It's a case with so many twists and turns.
It really is. And yet, even with all the details that we've uncovered, there are still so many unanswered questions that linger.
Right. What are some of the biggest mysteries that still surround this case? What can we explore further in our final part?
Okay, so we're back, and we've been on quite a journey through the twisted case of Cecil Henry Floyd. From a seemingly straightforward arrest to a confession that opened up a Pandora's box of potential victims, legal loopholes, and a trail of unanswered questions that stretches across decades. Yeah, and it's those unresolved mysteries that really make this case so captivating, even after all these years. As we head into the final part of our deep dive, let's revisit some of those lingering threads and see what kind of insights we can get.
Okay, yeah. So you mentioned earlier that one of the biggest unanswered questions is the true extent of Floyd's crimes, right? He confessed to 6 murders, but claimed responsibility for 5 more. Did investigators ever find any evidence to support those additional claims?
That's a question that still kind of haunts this case. Sadly, the information we have doesn't really give us a clear answer. It's possible law enforcement looked into those claims, but just couldn't connect them definitively. Imagine you're an investigator working on this case. You have a confession, but no bodies, no crime scenes, no witnesses. It's going to be incredibly difficult to prove or disprove those claims.
Right. It's like trying to solve a puzzle where half the pieces are missing. So we have these potential victims out there, maybe connected to Floyd, maybe not. It's a chilling thought.
Yeah, it is. And it really speaks to the ripple effect of the serial killer's actions, right? Even decades later, there are families who may not have closure. They may still be wondering if their loved one was a victim of Cecil Henry Floyd.
Absolutely. And then there's the mystery surrounding Lorna Jean Kern, Floyd's wife. She claimed to be coerced into the marriage and was later extradited to Florida as material witness. But after that, her story just kind of disappears from the narrative. Was she ever charged with any crimes? Did she cooperate with investigators? What became of her?
Those are tough questions to answer. The sources we have just don't provide much information about what happened to Lorna after her involvement in the Florida case. I mean, we can speculate, of course. Maybe she was granted some form of immunity in exchange for her testimony. Maybe she entered witness protection. Or maybe she simply faded back into obscurity, choosing to leave that chapter of her life behind.
It's a reminder that even in a case focused on a serial killer, there are other lives impacted, other stories that often remain untold. And it makes you wonder about the long-term psychological effects on someone who was, by her own account, forced into a relationship with a man who turned out to be a monster.
For sure. We tend to focus on the perpetrators in these cases.
Sure.
But the trauma experienced by their families, their victims, the witnesses, it's a huge part of the story that I think we often overlook.
Absolutely. And speaking of overlooked, we can't forget about the Dickinson County John Doe, the unidentified hitchhiker found murdered in Kansas. His case was never truly closed, and even with the exhumation and attempts to use DNA technology, he remains nameless.
His story just highlights the human cost of these crimes.
Yeah.
He's not just a statistic, not just another name on a list. This was a person with a life, with a story. And because of Floyd's actions, that story was cut short and remains incomplete.
Yeah. It's a reminder that justice isn't always black and white, that sometimes, even with convictions and confessions, there are loose threads that may never be tied up.
Exactly. And in a way, that's the case with Cecil Henry Floyd himself. We know the crimes he committed, the lives he took, the legal battles that ensued, but we're left with this sense of incompleteness. Were there more victims out there? What really motivated his spree? What was the full extent of Lorna's involvement? These are all questions that may never have definitive answers.
So where do we go from here? We've delved into the darkness, uncovered chilling details, and grappled with the complexities of a case that spans decades. What's the takeaway for our listeners?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that true crime isn't just about entertainment. It's about trying to understand the human condition, both in its darkest and most hopeful forms. It's about grappling with the complexities of justice and recognizing that sometimes closure just isn't possible.
Right, and it's also about remembering the victims, those whose stories were cut short and those whose stories remain untold. It's about acknowledging the ripple effect of violence and the enduring quest for answers, even when those answers are difficult to find.
We've only scratched the surface of this case. We encourage you to continue exploring the sources we've used, do your own research, and maybe, just maybe, you'll uncover a piece of the puzzle that brings us closer to a complete understanding of the Cecil Henry Floyd case.
And that's our deep dive into the chilling case of Cecil Henry Floyd. We'll be back soon with another fascinating journey into the world of true crime and unsolved mysteries. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the stories of the victims alive.